The Siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and most devastating sieges in modern warfare, began on September 8, 1941, and lasted for 872 days. Its origins lay in the larger strategic goals of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941. Adolf Hitler aimed not only to defeat the Red Army, but also to obliterate Soviet cities that he considered politically or culturally significant. Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union's second-largest city, held symbolic and strategic importance. Encircling and starving the city, rather than storming it outright, was intended to deliver both psychological and logistical blows to Soviet morale and infrastructure. Following initial advances through the Baltic states and Belarus, the German Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, made a rapid push toward Leningrad. They coordinated with Finnish forces advancing from the north, forming a pincer movement designed to isolate the city. By early September 1941, the last roads into Leningrad were cut off. The Germans reached Lake Ladoga in the east and the Gulf of Finland in the west, effectively encircling the city. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, under Joseph Stalin, had anticipated the strategic value of Leningrad and fortified it heavily, but the speed and effectiveness of the German advance left few options for a counteroffensive. The Soviet response was multi-pronged. General Georgy Zhukov, one of the USSR's most capable commanders, was dispatched to coordinate the defense. The city's leadership organized over 100,000 civilians to build fortifications, trenches, tank traps, and bunkers. Anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened, and naval units from the Baltic Fleet were stationed to support both defensive and logistical operations. Despite these efforts, the city's connection to the rest of the Soviet Union was severed except for a tenuous link via Lake Ladoga. This route would become vital in the months to come, eventually known as the Road of Life. The German strategy relied on a slow strangulation of the city rather than a costly urban assault. Daily artillery shelling and air raids aimed at military targets, infrastructure, and civilian areas were coupled with a blockade that prevented the entry of food, fuel, and medicine. Hitler explicitly ordered that the city should be left to starve, and any surrender should be refused. This grim policy of attrition turned Leningrad into a living hell for its citizens. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. Rationing was instituted, but the allocations were meager and grew worse as the siege continued. By November 1941, daily rations had dropped to 250 grams of bread for workers and 125 grams for dependents. As winter set in, the city faced one of its harshest tests. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was particularly severe, with temperatures plunging below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Heating systems failed due to a lack of fuel. Public transportation ceased. Water pipes froze, forcing residents to collect water from the Neva River, often under fire. Electricity was limited or non-existent. Thousands died daily from starvation, exposure, and disease. The city turned to desperate measures. Sawdust was added to bread, pets were eaten, and in extreme cases, cannibalism occurred. Yet even in these conditions, the Soviet government maintained a cultural and political front. Concerts were held, newspapers published, and schools continued to function in a limited capacity, all as part of a psychological effort to sustain morale and unity. One of the most iconic moments of the siege occurred in August 1942, when Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed in besieged Leningrad and smuggled out to be completed in Kibyshev, was performed in the city by the surviving members of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra. The performance, broadcast by loudspeakers across the city and the front lines, became a symbol of defiance. At the same time, the Red Army launched several offensives to break the siege. However, early attempts such as the Sinyavino Offensive in the autumn of 1941 and the Lyubin Offensive in early 1942 failed at heavy cost. The geography around Leningrad, forests, swamps, and rivers, favored the defenders, but the Germans fortified their positions to repel relief efforts. By the end of 1942, the Soviet Union had reorganized and rearmed. drawing on its vast resources and industrial relocation east of the Urals. Operation Iskra, launched in January 1943, marked a turning point. Soviet forces from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts finally succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. Though this did not lift the siege entirely, it allowed for the construction of a railway and pipeline that significantly improved supply routes. This lifeline reduced mortality rates and bolstered the city's ability to resist. Nonetheless, German artillery remained within range, and the siege dragged on. In the latter half of 1943, the momentum increasingly shifted in the Soviets' favor. Continued offensives eroded German positions around Leningrad. Soviet partisans operated behind enemy lines, disrupting supply chains and gathering intelligence. The Red Army intensified pressure along the entire Eastern Front, which diverted German reinforcements away from Leningrad. The final Soviet offensive to lift the siege, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, was launched in January 1944. After intense battles, the German forces began to withdraw, and on January 27, 1944, the siege was officially lifted. Celebrations broke out across the city, but the toll had been immense. More than 1 million civilians had perished, most from starvation. Entire families were lost and whole neighborhoods emptied. The city's infrastructure was crippled, industry decimated, and cultural landmarks damaged or destroyed. Yet the psychological and symbolic victory was undeniable. Leningrad had not surrendered, it had endured. Stalin hailed the defense as a triumph of Soviet resilience and used it to bolster wartime propaganda. Survivors received medals, and the city was later awarded the title of Hero City. The siege also became a critical component of the USSR's narrative of collective suffering and victory. In post-war years, Leningrad was gradually rebuilt. Monuments were erected, and cemeteries like Piskaryovskoye became sacred sites of remembrance. But the trauma lingered. For decades, survivors bore the scars, physical and emotional, of deprivation, loss, and horror. Only in recent years have researchers gained fuller access to Soviet archives, enabling a more nuanced understanding of decisions made by both German and Soviet authorities. The siege of Leningrad remains not only a testament to human endurance, but a stark reminder of the brutal logic of total war. Its legacy continues to resonate, both in Russia and globally, as a symbol of resilience under impossible circumstances. Historians still debate the strategic decisions, the preventable suffering, and the political manipulations that accompanied the siege. But there is no debate about the human cost. The story of Leningrad, of those who lived and those who died during the 872 days of siege, is etched into the collective memory of the 20th century, a harrowing chapter of World War II that must never be forgotten. The German advance toward Leningrad continued throughout July and August 1941 with unrelenting momentum. Army Group North pushed through the Baltic states, capturing Riga and forcing Soviet forces into a series of hurried retreats. The fall of Tallinn in late August, after a bloody naval evacuation, marked the collapse of Soviet control over Estonia and left the approaches to Leningrad increasingly vulnerable. Meanwhile, Finnish forces, eager to reclaim territories lost during the Winter War, advanced from the north toward the Karelian Isthmus and Lake Ladoga, effectively sealing the city from the northeast. By the end of the summer, Leningrad was nearly surrounded. Within the city itself, the situation became increasingly dire. Civil defense measures were rapidly implemented, including the conscription of civilians for the construction of fortifications, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles. The Leningrad Front was formed in late August to organize the defense of the city under the command of General Kliment Voroshilov and later Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Despite the catastrophic losses suffered by the Red Army during the opening weeks of the war, efforts were made to bring reinforcements, artillery, and supplies into the city before it was fully encircled. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured Schlisselburg, a town on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting the last major land route into Leningrad. This marked the formal beginning of the siege. Rather than attempt a costly urban assault, Hitler issued Directive No. 1601, stating that the city was to be encircled, bombarded, and starved into submission. The German High Command estimated that Leningrad, cut off from food supplies and subjected to continual artillery and aerial bombardment, would collapse within a few weeks. The Nazi strategy was not merely military, it was genocidal. German documents recovered after the war made clear that the intention was not to occupy the city but to exterminate its population. Leningrad was to be erased from existence, with survivors either perishing or being driven eastward. Supplies were to be refused even if the city surrendered. As a result, the siege of Leningrad became not only a tactical encirclement, but a deliberate campaign of annihilation against a civilian population. Inside the city, preparations for survival began under extreme pressure. Food rationing was instituted, and emergency stockpiles were created in warehouses across Leningrad. However, these supplies proved grossly insufficient. The pre-war population of Leningrad was over 3 million, and despite partial evacuations before the encirclement, more than 2.5 million civilians, including 400,000 children, remained within the city when the siege began. The city's administration, led by Mayor Andrei Zhdanov and the Leningrad Party Committee, attempted to maintain order and morale. Propaganda stressed the heroic legacy of Leningrad and the need for sacrifice. Factories were relocated underground or fortified to continue arms production. Workers were encouraged to continue laboring despite hunger and shellfire. Nonetheless, as autumn approached, the reality of total encirclement and the looming threat of starvation began to weigh heavily on the city's inhabitants. The Luftwaffe began systematic bombings of infrastructure, targeting food warehouses, water supply lines, and power plants. In one devastating attack on September 8th, a massive food warehouse at Badaev was destroyed, incinerating thousands of tons of vital supplies. Though some emergency caches remained, the destruction of Badaev severely worsened the city's food situation and contributed to the rapid onset of famine. By October 1941, Leningrad was a city under siege in every sense. Electricity was limited, water lines were damaged or frozen, and transport had all but ceased. Artillery fire from German and Finnish positions occurred daily. The population now faced not just the violence of war, but the slow, grinding onset of starvation. With winter approaching and the blockade tightening, the stage was set for one of the most horrific episodes of civilian suffering in modern warfare. As the brutal Russian winter descended upon Leningrad in late 1941, the city's descent into humanitarian catastrophe began in earnest. Temperatures plummeted to below 30 degrees, and with it came a collapse in all basic services. Heating ceased in most buildings, the water system froze, and electricity became a rare luxury. The centralized food distribution system began to fail under the weight of shortages and desperation. Already minimal rations were reduced again and again. By November, a manual laborer received only 250 grams of bread per day. Dependents and children received half that. This bread, often stretched with sawdust or cellulose to make it last, was the primary, and in many cases the only food available. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. Starvation spread through every district of the city, indifferent to profession, age, or ideology. People collapsed in the streets, too weak to stand, often left where they fell. Public services could no longer keep up with the collection of corpses. Mass graves were dug in cemeteries or simply in parks and courtyards, as the dead numbered in the tens of thousands. Families resorted to desperate measures, eating wallpaper for the paste, boiling leather belts, grinding up animal feed, and even, in some cases, cannibalism. The NKVD reported hundreds of cases of corpse consumption and eventually the killing of people for food, which led to the creation of special units to monitor and punish such crimes. Despite the unimaginable suffering, Leningrad did not descend into chaos. Order surprisingly persisted. The city government, under Leningrad's party leadership, continued to function in a limited capacity. A skeleton bureaucracy maintained bread distribution, ration cards, and emergency services. Cultural institutions were mobilized for morale. The Philharmonic Orchestra rehearsed and performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. written in and dedicated to Leningrad under extreme conditions, with emaciated musicians in freezing halls. The performance was broadcast by loudspeaker throughout the city and to German lines, becoming a potent symbol of defiance. The Red Army's attempts to break the siege during the winter of 1941-1942 were largely unsuccessful. The city's defenders held a tenuous perimeter, but German forces were deeply entrenched, and Finnish troops in the north refused to advance further, creating a static line. Relief would come not through offensive success, but from a remarkable logistical feat, the opening of the Road of Life across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. This icy lifeline became operational in late November 1941. Soviet engineers, working under shell fire and freezing temperatures, established a temporary transport route to the eastern shore of the lake. Trucks ferried food and supplies into the city and evacuated civilians on the return journey. Though dangerous and slow, subject to German air and artillery attacks, the route provided the only artery of life to the besieged population. Thousands of tons of flour, grain, and fuel were eventually delivered, but it was never enough to restore normalcy. At best, it prevented total extinction. As winter turned to spring in 1942, the thaw brought new suffering. Melting snow revealed the bodies of the unburied, and disease began to spread. Typhus and dysentery joined hunger as killers. Food supplies improved slightly with increased traffic over Lake Ladoga, but mortality remained staggering. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 800,000 civilians died in the first year of the siege alone, mostly from starvation. Yet the Soviet leadership remained committed to the defense of the city. Stalin refused to consider evacuation or surrender, fearing the psychological and symbolic blow such a loss would deliver. Instead, he encouraged a narrative of resilience and glory. The defense of Leningrad became a central motif in Soviet wartime propaganda. Films, posters, and radio broadcasts celebrated the City of Heroes. Survivors were cast as symbols of Soviet endurance, while the dead were quietly absorbed into the mythos of sacrifice. Industrial production, though greatly reduced, never ceased. Factories continued to produce weapons and ammunition, often with workers too weak to stand. Many worked in shifts of 2 hours, resting in between on cots by their machines. Children were mobilized to gather snow for melting, to collect scrap metal, and even to serve in anti-aircraft units. The siege had turned Leningrad into a fortress sustained by human willpower alone. Despite the scale of suffering, Leningrad did not fall. The city's defenses held, and its people endured. The German strategy of starvation, designed to bring the city to its knees, had failed to achieve its political objective. Hitler's assumption that civilian morale would collapse and the Soviets would surrender was proven catastrophically wrong. Instead, the siege entered its second year, shifting from acute horror to prolonged endurance. The psychological toll, however, was immense. Entire families perished. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from survivors reflect a slow erosion of identity, morality, and time. Hunger distorted perception. Neighbors became threats, bodies became resources, and life shrank to the scale of ration lines and foot journeys. Yet through this, Leningrad became a testament to the endurance of civilians under siege, a city that refused to die, not through might, but through an unbroken will to survive. Spring and summer of 1942 brought a grim stability to Leningrad. The worst of the famine had passed, but only because so many had already died. With the Lake Ladoga ice route replaced by a tenuous boat convoy system and new overland routes being built under constant attack, a trickle of supplies reached the city, just enough to prevent further mass starvation. Yet for most residents, hunger remained constant, death remained common, and the psychological weight of the siege only deepened with time. By mid-1942, Leningrad had become not a city in the traditional sense, but a fortress island of survival. The civilian government continued to function, astonishingly, despite its skeleton staff and the daily threat of bombardment. Mayor Popkov and Party Secretary Zhdanov issued endless directives aimed at maintaining social cohesion. Street cleaning, cultural performances, mandatory factory labor, even if the workers could barely walk. Public announcements continued to declare Soviet optimism, though everyone understood the widening gulf between rhetoric and reality. Hundreds of thousands of civilians still died in 1942, not just from hunger but from disease, overwork, and the psychological breakdown induced by trauma. Suicide rates increased, families disappeared without record. Pets had long since vanished. Trees were cut down for firewood. Stone bookshelves and walls were disassembled for fuel. Yet people still queued for concerts and lectures. Life became a statement of defiance. Militarily, the Germans had settled into a strategy of attrition. Encircling the city in a tight ring, they consolidated positions in the south near Pushkin and in the southwest near the Pulkovo Heights, where artillery fire could reach the city's center. German shelling became part of daily life, random, deadly, and unceasing. Entire neighborhoods were depopulated. Children memorized the sound of incoming shells and learned when to run. The Luftwaffe, though less active than during the initial phase of the siege, still launched periodic bombing raids, particularly targeting Ladoga supply depots, power plants, and rail stations. In the north, Finnish forces held their line near the River Svir and the Karelian Isthmus. Though technically not involved in the shelling of the city, their presence helped complete the noose. Stalin, suspicious of Finnish intentions and bitter from the Winter War, feared a second offensive from the north, but Helsinki refused. The Finns had no interest in Leningrad's destruction. Their goal was territorial recovery, not the extermination of a city. This created a strange tension, lethal pressure from the Germans, and cold containment from the Finns. In August 1942, a remarkable cultural event took place that would become one of the most iconic moments of the entire siege. Composer Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony Num. 7, written during the early months of the blockade, was performed in the besieged city by the Leningrad Radio Orchestra, conducted by Karl Eliasberg. The performance was only possible through extraordinary effort. Many of the musicians had to be pulled from hospitals. Some had died. Others were too weak to hold their instruments. Rehearsals occurred in freezing rooms. Yet the broadcast, transmitted across the city and even to German positions via loudspeakers, had a psychological impact well beyond its artistic value. To the citizens, it was proof that they were still alive. To the enemy, it was a taunt. This city, ravaged by death, would not go quietly. On the military front, the Red Army launched several operations to break the blockade in 1942, none of which succeeded. The Sinyavino offensive in August-September aimed to open a corridor to the city by attacking the Germans southeast of Lake Ladoga. Initial gains were made, but the German 18th Army counterattacked, cutting off Soviet units and inflicting heavy casualties. Stalin had hoped the attack would coincide with the wider Stalingrad counteroffensive to the south, but the coordination failed. The blockade remained intact. Despite repeated setbacks, the Soviet command continued to plan. The Volkhov and Leningrad fronts remained active, launching probing attacks and preparing for future offensives. A network of intelligence-gathering units, partisans behind German lines, informants, and intercept units fed the general staff with data on German positions. Engineers and sappers worked ceaselessly on new supply routes, pipelines for fuel, under-lake communication cables, and eventually the Ladoga railway line, known as the Victory Road, completed in early 1943. Internally, the Soviet state continued its iron grip on the population. The NKVD monitored dissent, punished panic-mongers, and managed forced labor. Loyalty was rewarded with food access, and denunciation of neighbors became a tool for survival. Propaganda maintained the myth of unity, but cracks appeared. In some districts, ration corruption became rampant, with black markets forming even amid starvation. Military tribunals oversaw discipline among soldiers, many of whom were barely distinguishable from civilians in their emaciated condition. Discipline, at times, became indistinguishable from repression. By the end of 1942, the death toll had surpassed 800,000 civilians. Yet the city still held. More than 1 million remained. Factories continued to produce tanks, shells, and guns, many sent directly to the Stalingrad front. The paradox of Leningrad was becoming clear. a dying city that was still functioning, a symbol of Soviet strength sustained by unthinkable sacrifice. As the war reached its turning point at Stalingrad in late 1942, a new hope began to rise. The Soviets had finally seized the initiative, and with it came the preparation for what would become the most significant breakthrough attempt since the siege began, a joint operation to break the blockade not with desperation, but with coordination, firepower, and resolve. Leningrad had survived another year. Now it would fight to be free. The beginning of 1943 marked a pivotal shift in the siege of Leningrad. After more than 16 months of encirclement, starvation, and bombardment, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, Spark, a coordinated military offensive designed to pierce the German blockade and re-establish a land corridor to the besieged city. On January 12, 1943, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts struck from opposite sides of the narrowest section of the German line, south of Lake Ladoga, targeting the German 18th Army's positions near the town of Schlisselburg. The fighting was brutal and costly. The terrain, swampy and frozen, heavily fortified and crisscrossed with German strongpoints, forced Soviet troops into close-quarters engagements. But this time, unlike previous attempts, Soviet artillery had been concentrated, air support was well coordinated, and the planning was precise. After nearly 2 weeks of combat, the two attacking Soviet fronts met on January 18th, cutting a narrow 10 to 12-kilometer wide corridor through enemy lines. For the first time since September 1941, Leningrad was no longer completely encircled. Though the breakthrough did not end the siege, it changed everything. A temporary railway line, nicknamed the Victory Road, was quickly constructed across the narrow corridor, protected by anti-aircraft guns and camouflaged by night. Supplies began to arrive by train, allowing for a more consistent delivery of food, fuel, and ammunition. Evacuations resumed, especially for children, the wounded, and the chronically ill. The blockade, though still deadly, had been fractured. The psychological impact on the population was immense. For many, it was the first moment of tangible hope. Yet conditions in Leningrad remained dire. The city's infrastructure had been pushed to the brink. Heating systems were still largely non-functional. Public transportation had collapsed. Sanitation was primitive. Disease continued to spread, and malnutrition had become chronic. Children born during the siege showed signs of permanent developmental disorders. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from scurvy, frostbite, and psychological trauma. Many survivors experienced hallucinations, memory loss, or emotional withdrawal. The toll of long-term starvation was evident in every neighborhood, every face. The winter of 1942-1943 also revealed the long-term effects of the siege on urban life. Entire districts of Leningrad had been depopulated. Apartment buildings sat empty. Schools had closed or operated with skeletal staff. Churches were shuttered or repurposed. Even in factories where production had persisted, the workforce was aged, weakened, and exhausted. Thousands of workers had died at their posts. Others labored in silence, too tired for conversation. The sounds of children playing or street vendors shouting had vanished. Leningrad was a city of silence and smoke, where survival itself had become a full-time occupation. Despite this, Soviet authorities intensified their efforts to maintain a sense of normalcy and ideological cohesion. Newspapers continued to circulate, filled with stories of heroism, sacrifice, and Soviet unity. Parades and commemorations were staged whenever conditions allowed. Patriotic posters adorned crumbling walls, often depicting smiling workers and victorious Red Army soldiers. The contrast between propaganda and reality was stark, but also necessary in the eyes of the state to preserve morale. Meanwhile, the Red Army, emboldened by the success at Stalingrad and the partial lifting of the blockade, began preparations for a broader offensive. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, artillery duels and reconnaissance raids intensified around the southern approaches to Leningrad. The Germans, recognizing the strategic threat, reinforced their positions with additional infantry and artillery. They also stepped up aerial bombardments, launching periodic raids on the Victory Road and the Ladoga supply route. In the city, even limited improvements in supply changed the fabric of daily life. Bread rations were gradually increased. Communal kitchens reopened, though portions remained small. The black market continued to flourish, often with the complicity of local officials. Small luxuries, sugar, tobacco, soap, became the new currency of survival. Survivors described the return of smells, of bread, soup, wet earth, as moments of overwhelming emotion. For many, the first taste of fresh bread after months of ersatz substitutes marked a spiritual turning point, as if life had, however faintly, begun to return. Culturally, the city remained astonishingly active. Writers, painters, and musicians documented the horrors around them. Poets like Olga Bergholz became the voice of the blockade, broadcasting her verses on radio, lifting spirits with grim but lyrical resolve. Artists sketched the ruined streets, the queues, the empty gazes of survivors. The Leningrad diary, kept by multiple citizens, chronicled starvation, loss, and moments of humanity in harrowing detail. These cultural records would later become central to the memory of the siege, offering intimate testimony beyond the statistics of death and tonnage. Still, death was ever present. Even with improved logistics, the siege continued to claim thousands of lives. Mortar fire remained common, and German long-range artillery could still reach many central districts. The Germans also experimented with psychological warfare, airdropping leaflets offering food and safety to defectors, spreading rumors of coming offensives, and attempting to break civilian resolve. These efforts largely failed. The citizens of Leningrad had grown impervious to fear campaigns. They no longer dreamed of rescue or revenge, only of endurance. By late 1943, with Soviet forces advancing across Ukraine and the Germans retreating on multiple fronts, strategic conditions began to favor a full-scale liberation of the region. Leningrad, however, remained locked in its own war of attrition, a slow bleed that refused to stop. The siege was not yet over, but its ending was now visible on the horizon. Plans were already being drawn for the operation that would break the German ring entirely. Leningrad had suffered longer than any other city in the war. Now it was preparing for retribution. The final months of 1943 marked the gradual but deliberate preparation for a full military campaign to liberate Leningrad from its 2.5-year nightmare. While the partial breach of the siege in January had allowed the trickle of supplies and limited evacuation, the city remained under the constant threat of German artillery and surrounded on most sides. The Red Army's High Command, Stavka, recognized that only a coordinated multi-front offensive could finally lift the blockade and push the Wehrmacht far enough from the city's outskirts to ensure its survival. That operation would come in January 1944. But the path to it was paved by months of build-up, quiet suffering, and tightening resolve. Throughout the second half of 1943, Soviet forces around Leningrad executed a series of limited offensives designed to wear down German positions and divert attention from larger preparations. In the south, Soviet troops attacked German strongholds near MGA and Sinyavino, strategic areas that had long served as German artillery platforms. Though these attacks met stiff resistance and incurred high casualties, they succeeded in forcing the Germans to divert resources and revealed growing vulnerabilities in their defensive network. Concurrently, the Soviet Union used its revitalized industrial base to improve the logistical situation around the city. A second, more durable rail line was constructed across the Lake Ladoga corridor. Pontoon bridges, pipelines, and defensive emplacements turned the previously precarious supply route into a semi-permanent logistical artery. This allowed more consistent shipments of ammunition, fuel, and food, and brought badly needed reinforcements into the area. Soviet planners moved artillery batteries, armored brigades, and fresh infantry divisions into staging positions just east of the German line, all while camouflaging their buildup through deception operations and night movements. Inside Leningrad, this buildup brought visible changes to daily life. While far from normal, the city no longer teetered on the brink of starvation. Public services, garbage collection, postal routes, electricity grids were slowly reactivated. Schools reopened in underground shelters. Some theaters resumed limited performances. Radio broadcasts became more frequent and optimistic. Civilians were still expected to contribute to the war effort, but now with tools instead of desperation. Teenage girls worked in munitions plants. Elderly men dug trenches or assisted with deliveries. Even young children were assigned to assist with messaging and logistics. Life had not returned, but it was no longer vanishing. The German command, meanwhile, recognized the precariousness of its situation, but was unable to respond effectively. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, was overstretched and suffering from chronic supply shortages. Hitler, as always, refused to allow tactical withdrawals, believing that any concession near Leningrad would be a symbolic and strategic disaster. As a result, German units were left holding thin, overstretched lines across swampy, forested terrain, vulnerable to encirclement and increasingly demoralized. Their positions around Oranienbaum, Krasnoye Selo, and Pushkin were built to hold, not to maneuver. In the face of a large-scale Soviet offensive, they would prove brittle. Meanwhile, Finnish forces to the north remained largely static. Although technically Germany's co-belligerents, the Finns had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Nazi strategy. Their leadership was already making quiet diplomatic overtures to the Western Allies and had no intention of participating in any renewed offensive against Leningrad. This allowed the Soviets to concentrate their efforts entirely on the German line without fear of a northern thrust. Throughout autumn, reconnaissance flights, partisan intelligence, and signal intercepts confirmed Soviet intentions. The Germans knew an attack was coming, but not when or where. Soviet deception efforts, including false radio traffic, dummy encampments, and feigned troop movements, successfully masked the scale and direction of the actual offensive. By the end of December 1943, over 1.2 million Soviet troops, 1,500 tanks, 13,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 1,400 aircraft were concentrated in 3 sectors around Leningrad. The offensive would begin with the Leningrad-Novgorod operation, under the command of General Leonid Govorov and Marshal Kirill Meretskov. Its objectives were ambitious: drive the Germans back from Leningrad's immediate vicinity, break the siege completely, destroy enemy units in the region, and liberate key towns such as Krasnoye Selo and Pushkin. If successful, it would end the siege once and for all and allow Leningrad to rejoin the Soviet Union not as a symbol of endurance, but as a functioning military-industrial city. On the eve of the offensive, the atmosphere in Leningrad was one of contained anticipation. Propaganda broadcasts hinted at a coming blow. Leaflets distributed in factories encouraged vigilance and promised that vengeance was near. Soldiers prepared their weapons. Civilians donated what they could: blood, food, clothing, for the front. Few slept. Everyone understood what was at stake. The siege had already cost more than 1 million civilian lives. Now the opportunity had come to strike back. As January 1944 dawned, the snow-covered forests and fields around Leningrad were filled with Soviet artillery, concealed infantry, and armored columns poised to erupt forward. For nearly 900 days, the city had been encircled, starved, and bombarded. Now, the encirclement would be broken, not with desperation, but with overwhelming force. The Red Army was ready. The siege, for the first time, had a real chance of ending, not by survival, but by liberation. On January 14, 1944, the Soviet Union launched one of the most decisive operations of the Eastern Front, the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. After nearly 900 days of siege, the Red Army unleashed a massive, multi-pronged assault designed to finally shatter the German stranglehold around the city. This was not a probing attack or a symbolic gesture. It was a calculated hammer blow. The objective was not simply to lift the blockade, but to destroy Army Group North's presence in the Leningrad region entirely and liberate the surrounding towns that had languished under German occupation since 1941. The offensive began with a devastating artillery barrage. Over 220,000 shells were fired in a matter of hours across the southern and southwestern approaches to the city, targeting German positions in Krasnoye Selo, Pushkin, and Ropsha. This bombardment, one of the largest ever conducted on the Northern Front, was immediately followed by the advance of Soviet infantry and armor from the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts. Simultaneously, the Second Shock Army broke out of the Oranienbaum bridgehead, an isolated Soviet-held pocket on the Gulf of Finland that had been cut off since the early days of the siege. Now, it served as a perfect launch pad for a flanking maneuver against German rear lines. The effect of this coordinated assault was immediate and catastrophic for the Germans. Their front lines, already weakened and undermanned, collapsed in several sectors. Soviet troops advanced rapidly, overrunning bunkers and trenches. Towns that had been occupied for over 2 years fell in quick succession. Krasnoye Selo was liberated by January 19th, followed by Ropsha the next day. Pushkin, once a royal residence and cultural jewel turned military outpost, was recaptured by the Red Army after heavy fighting and widespread destruction. The German 18th Army, which had been responsible for holding the siege ring around the city, found itself in an impossible position. Overstretched, suffering from supply shortages, and denied permission to retreat, German units were encircled and destroyed in several engagements. Hitler, as usual, forbade strategic withdrawal, insisting on a no-step-back policy that cost thousands of German lives and accelerated the Soviet breakthrough. By the end of January, the Soviet advance had driven the Germans back between 60 and 100 kilometers from the city limits, forcing them to abandon the last artillery positions capable of striking Leningrad's urban core. On January 27, 1944, the Soviet government officially declared that the siege of Leningrad had been lifted. It was a moment of both immense relief and overwhelming sorrow. Church bells rang across the city for the first time in years. Survivors wept openly in the streets. A massive artillery salute shook the skies, a gesture of both celebration and mourning. The siege had lasted 872 days and claimed the lives of over 1 million civilians, as well as hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Entire families had perished. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. Yet the city stood. For the Red Army, the end of the siege represented more than a local victory. It was a turning point in the northern theater of the war. With Army Group North in full retreat, Soviet forces began pressing toward the Baltic states, aiming to liberate Estonia and cut off the Germans from Finland. The destruction of the German positions around Leningrad opened a new phase in the war, shifting the initiative firmly and permanently into Soviet hands. Within Leningrad, the psychological impact of liberation was enormous but complex. Relief was tempered by the physical and emotional scars that the siege had left behind. Streets were still lined with ruined buildings. The dead were still being uncovered in shallow graves and rubble. Malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma remained endemic. Yet the lifting of the blockade restored the possibility of recovery. Supply trains began to arrive regularly. Reconstruction committees were formed. Civilians returned from evacuation zones. For the first time in nearly 3 years, there was a sense of future. Stalin capitalized heavily on the victory, hailing Leningrad as a hero city and awarding its defenders numerous military honors. The city's endurance became central to Soviet wartime mythology. The propaganda machine elevated the siege to an epic of resistance, emphasizing unity, sacrifice, and patriotism. Streets were renamed, monuments were planned, and mass parades were held, even as rubble still lay in the streets and food remained scarce. Meanwhile, the military campaign did not pause. The Soviet advance pressed forward. The Leningrad front pursued retreating German forces toward Narva and Pskov. In the weeks following the siege's end, more than 30 towns and villages were liberated, many of them completely depopulated or destroyed. Partisan units emerged from the forests, linking up with the Red Army. German forces, facing collapse, hastily constructed new defensive lines, but the tide had turned decisively. The siege of Leningrad was over, but its legacy had only just begun. The city, scarred and hollowed, now faced the enormous task of rebuilding, not just its infrastructure, but its collective memory, its population, and its place in the post-war Soviet Union. The events of January 1944 marked the end of a military nightmare, but they also began a new chapter. The transformation of Leningrad from a city under siege into a symbol of Soviet survival and resilience. The end of the siege of Leningrad was not only a story of collective endurance, it was also shaped by a complex network of individuals whose decisions, strategies, and sacrifices influenced the course of the blockade. From military commanders and political leaders to engineers, civilians, and even cultural figures, the outcome of the siege was molded by key players on both sides of the front. Their legacies are inseparable from the broader narrative of the 872-day struggle. Among the most prominent figures was Marshal Leonid Govorov, the commander of the Leningrad Front from April 1942 onward. A quiet and methodical leader, Govorov was instrumental in transforming the city's defense from static survival to offensive strategy. Under his command, the Leningrad Front oversaw Operation Iskra in 1943 and the final Leningrad-Novgorod offensive in January 1944. Govorov's strength lay in his analytical approach, his careful coordination of artillery and infantry movements, and his understanding of urban warfare under siege conditions. His leadership played a decisive role in the lifting of the blockade and earned him the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Working closely with Govorov was Marshal Kirill Meretskov, commander of the Volkhov Front. A veteran of the Winter War and an early victim of Stalin's purges, he was arrested and tortured by the NKVD in 1941 but later reinstated. Meretskov brought both experience and cautious pragmatism to the coordination of external offensives. His forces, operating to the east and southeast of the city, played a critical role in the pincer movements that ultimately broke the German lines. Meretskov's ability to manage multi-front operations and exploit weaknesses in the German defense contributed significantly to the Soviet breakthrough. On the civilian side, Andrei Zhdanov, the Leningrad Party secretary and head of the city's defense committee, was the highest-ranking political authority within the besieged city. A close ally of Stalin, Zhdanov was responsible for implementing the ideological line, managing civil order, and maintaining morale. He oversaw rationing, censorship, and propaganda, ensuring that the image of Leningrad as a fortress city endured despite starvation and mass death. Zhdanov's role remains controversial, praised for his organizational effectiveness, but also criticized for brutal repression and prioritization of propaganda over relief. Beneath him stood Mayor Pyotr Popkov, who worked on the front lines of administration during the siege. Popkov supervised the distribution of food, fuel, and basic services, often coordinating emergency responses to bombing raids and famine outbreaks. His efforts to keep the city functioning under extreme pressure were essential, though he was later arrested during Stalin's post-war purges and died in prison in 1950, a stark reminder of the fragility of survival, even for loyal Soviet officials. Among the most iconic cultural figures of the blockade was Dmitry Shostakovich, the composer of the Leningrad Symphony. Though evacuated early in the war, Shostakovich became a national symbol of the city's resistance. His image working in firefighter gear atop the conservatory was broadcast around the world. The performance of his Seventh Symphony in August 1942, organized by conductor Karl Eliasberg, who rallied starving musicians, was both a musical and political triumph. It embodied the will of Leningrad to survive not just physically, but spiritually. The Soviet leadership beyond Leningrad also played decisive roles. Joseph Stalin personally ordered that the city be held at all costs. He directed the allocation of resources to maintain minimal supply lines, blocked suggestions to evacuate the population fully, and used Leningrad's endurance as a pillar of wartime propaganda. His strategic decisions, though often brutal, ensured that the city remained in Soviet hands, but at a staggering human cost. Opposing them on the German side were commanders such as Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, the original head of Army Group North during the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa. Leeb led the advance toward Leningrad in 1941, but found himself caught between military realities and Hitler's ideological obsession with the city's destruction. When Leeb proposed a tactical withdrawal to shorten the front and concentrate forces, Hitler removed him from command. His successors, including Field Marshal Georg von Kuchler, were more compliant but equally constrained. forced to hold untenable positions as Soviet strength grew. One of the more notorious figures linked to the siege was General Georg Lindemann, commander of the German 18th Army. His units enforced the blockade and carried out the shelling of Leningrad's civilian areas. While operating under Hitler's directives, Lindemann's forces also engaged in punitive raids, destruction of infrastructure, and forced labor, further exacerbating the suffering of the population. After the war, many German commanders would claim they were simply following orders, but evidence shows deliberate targeting of civilian morale was a central feature of the siege strategy. Among the lesser-known but vital contributors were engineers like Major General Ivan Zaitsev, who helped construct the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga, and medical personnel like Professor Alexander Myasnikov, who managed wartime hospitals with virtually no supplies. Thousands of unsung women operated mobile kitchens, communication posts, and field hospitals. Teenagers manned anti-aircraft guns. Teachers held lessons in freezing basements. The key players of the siege extended far beyond generals and politicians. They included the very people who refused to die. Ultimately, the lifting of the siege was not a triumph of one leader or one decision, but of overlapping networks of resistance: military, civilian, cultural, and logistical. It was the coordination between fronts, the persistence of exhausted commanders, the survival instincts of civilians, and the sheer human cost of unyielding pressure that brought about the end of one of history's most grueling sieges. Each player, by choice or by circumstance, shaped a city's fate. While the official lifting of the siege on January 27, 1944, marked the end of the physical encirclement of Leningrad, its deeper consequences continued to unfold long after the final artillery batteries fell silent. The city had endured one of the most prolonged and destructive sieges in recorded history, and even in victory, it emerged gravely wounded. The scale of devastation, physical, psychological, demographic, and cultural, defied imagination, and the legacy of the siege would shape not only the future of Leningrad, but also the post-war identity of the entire Soviet Union. Demographically, the loss of life was catastrophic. Pre-war Leningrad had a population of over 3 million. By the time the siege was lifted, fewer than 600,000 civilians remained. Official Soviet figures estimate that at least 800,000 civilians died during the blockade, primarily from starvation, but many historians believe the true number may exceed 1 million when accounting for unregistered deaths, buried mass graves, and people who simply disappeared. Entire families were wiped out. Many survivors were left childless, orphaned, or with lifelong health complications caused by prolonged malnutrition and stress. The effects of starvation went far beyond the visible toll. Medical studies conducted in the post-war years revealed that children born during or shortly after the siege had elevated rates of physical and cognitive disorders. Survivors exhibited chronic heart, liver, and digestive problems, while mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorders became endemic. Sleep disorders, depression, and memory dysfunction were widespread among those who had lived through the worst winters. Yet despite this, psychological suffering was rarely acknowledged publicly. The official narrative emphasized heroic sacrifice, not trauma. The physical destruction of the city was equally immense. German artillery and aerial bombing had damaged or destroyed tens of thousands of buildings, including residential homes, schools, cultural institutions, and hospitals. Bridges were damaged, factories were crippled, and the city's water and electrical systems had been reduced to emergency functionality. Entire districts, especially in the south and east, were uninhabitable. As the front lines moved westward, Soviet engineering units were dispatched to begin clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, and restoring essential services. Yet reconstruction was slow, expensive, and politically complicated. The blockade also created a rupture in cultural memory. Censorship, secrecy, and ideological control shaped the official story of the siege. While the Soviet government celebrated the resilience of Leningrad, it selectively edited the darker truths, particularly the starvation, cannibalism, mass graves, and the failures of supply and planning. Diaries, letters, and eyewitness accounts that contradicted the heroic narrative were hidden or suppressed. Writers who depicted the suffering too bluntly were often silenced or marginalized. Olga Bergholz, once the voice of the siege on radio, faced increasing censorship in the late 1940s. Works of art that focused on trauma rather than triumph were quietly buried. Politically, the siege became a symbol of loyalty to the Soviet state and a tool for political manipulation. Joseph Stalin awarded Leningrad the title of Hero City in 1945, elevating it as a sacred site of Soviet sacrifice. Yet behind the praise lay suspicion. Stalin, wary of any regional prestige that could rival Moscow, initiated purges against the Leningrad Party leadership. Andrei Zhdanov had died in 1948, but many of his protégés and successors were arrested, exiled, or executed during the so-called Leningrad Affair of 1949-1950. It was a bitter irony. Those who had overseen the city's survival were later punished for their prominence. Economically, the siege delayed the city's post-war recovery by years. Factories that had remained functional during the blockade needed full overhauls. Skilled workers had died or been conscripted. Housing was critically short, and many families lived in communal apartments or temporary shelters well into the 1950s. Food rationing, though officially abolished, continued informally due to supply shortages. Only massive state investment, fueled by wartime reparations and central planning, allowed Leningrad to gradually re-emerge as a major industrial and cultural hub by the late 1950s. Yet amid this slow recovery, the memory of the siege was everywhere. Plaques marked the preserved walls, still pockmarked by shrapnel. "This side of the street is most dangerous during shelling," one read, never removed, even decades later. Monuments were erected to the victims. Mass graves were consecrated. The Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, where hundreds of thousands were buried, became a sacred site of mourning. Commemorations were held annually, with school children reciting the stories of their grandparents and veterans marching in silence. One of the most enduring mysteries of the blockade, however, was the question of what might have been done differently. Could more civilians have been evacuated? Could the road of life across Lake Ladoga have been opened earlier or made safer? Why were so many food convoys inadequately guarded? Could Stalin have done more to prioritize the city's defense in 1941? These questions remained largely unasked in the Soviet period, suppressed in favor of the official triumphalist narrative. It would take the glasnost era of the 1980s before more nuanced histories of the blockade emerged. Meanwhile, outside the Soviet Union, the siege remained underrepresented in the broader narrative of World War II. Western histories focused more on battles like Stalingrad or the Normandy invasion. The sheer duration and suffering of the Leningrad blockade, the civilian casualties, and the deliberate starvation policy of the German military received far less global attention. It was only in later decades that international historians began to recognize the siege not just as a Soviet tragedy, but as a humanitarian catastrophe of global significance. Even today, the siege of Leningrad remains one of the most haunting examples of total war. It exposed the brutal logic of attrition, the depths of human suffering under siege, and the terrifying costs of both survival and indifference. Its consequences were not limited to the battlefield. They reached into the fabric of memory, ideology, medicine, and mourning. It shaped generations, redefined the meaning of endurance, and remains a reminder that sometimes victory leaves as many scars as defeat. The siege of Leningrad stands not only as one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history, but as one of the clearest windows into the extremes of 20th century total war. It combined military strategy with ideological brutality, human endurance with systemic collapse, and political symbolism with physical annihilation. When the blockade was lifted in 1944, it did not simply end a chapter in the Second World War. It etched into global consciousness a symbol of both suffering and survival, heroism and horror, endurance and silence. From a military standpoint, the siege demonstrated the strategic limitations of Hitler's war aims. Rather than capturing Leningrad and exploiting its industrial and political value, the German High Command turned to a policy of extermination. The goal was not conquest but erasure, a siege intended to starve a city of over 3 million into non-existence. Yet this very approach exposed the Wehrmacht's overextension and inability to adapt to prolonged urban and logistical warfare. In holding Leningrad at all costs, Hitler tied down hundreds of thousands of troops in static positions that could have been used elsewhere. As the Red Army regained strength, those troops would become liabilities, encircled, broken, and ultimately expelled from the region. On the Soviet side, the siege tested the absolute limits of the Stalinist state. While the regime succeeded in holding the city, it did so at an extraordinary cost. The initial unpreparedness, failure to evacuate more civilians, and reliance on terror to maintain control revealed both logistical shortcomings and ideological rigidity. Yet simultaneously, the state's ability to sustain production, conduct massive engineering feats like the Road of Life, and keep a complex city barely functioning under total encirclement also demonstrated an unmatched capacity for centralized mobilization. The Soviet system, with all its brutality, proved capable of enduring a siege that would have broken almost any other modern urban center. Politically and culturally, the siege became central to the Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War. Leningrad was elevated not just as a site of resistance, but as a moral high ground. Its defenders, military and civilian alike, were immortalized as martyrs of socialism. The story of children freezing beside bread queues, orchestras performing symphonies during bombardments, and elderly women digging trenches with bare hands was transformed into a core component of Soviet identity. Yet this myth came at the price of silencing dissent, suppressing trauma, and erasing the full complexity of the suffering that occurred. Not until the late 20th century did diaries, letters, and survivor accounts begin to tell the unfiltered story of starvation, cannibalism, and abandonment. The legacy of the siege also reshaped urban warfare doctrine. Military analysts studied Leningrad alongside Stalingrad and Warsaw to understand how cities could resist prolonged sieges, how logistics could be improvised under fire, and how morale could survive mass civilian casualties. Yet the lessons were grim. The siege showed that with enough ideological resolve, a modern city could function under conditions that should have been fatal. That endurance, however, came not from heroism alone, but from coercion, repression, and the sheer absence of alternatives. The people of Leningrad did not choose to resist for glory. They resisted because they had no other choice. Ethically, the blockade raises enduring questions about the laws of war, the targeting of civilians, and the weaponization of hunger. While modern norms condemn starvation as a tool of warfare, Leningrad's experience underscores how those norms can break down during total war. The German decision to destroy food warehouses, cut supply lines, and bomb evacuation routes was not incidental. It was deliberate policy. And while the Soviets bear responsibility for mismanagement and political repression, the primary cause of civilian death during the siege was German military strategy. The Leningrad blockade thus occupies a moral category closer to genocide than to conventional combat. In post-war years, the memory of the siege was both sacred and politically useful. Veterans and survivors were honored publicly, but rarely heard privately. Monuments were built, ceremonies held, but many remained reluctant to speak of what they had truly seen and endured. The pain was too great, the losses too personal, and the official narrative too narrow. It was only in the era of glasnost that more honest conversations emerged about state failures, personal compromises, and the psychological damage left behind. Even today, in both Russia and the wider world, the full reckoning with Leningrad's suffering remains incomplete. Yet perhaps the most enduring truth of the siege lies in its contradiction. It was both a victory and a tragedy. The city was never taken, but at the price of over 1 million lives. It became a monument to Soviet strength, but also a silent graveyard. Its people endured with dignity, but were often forgotten or manipulated. The siege of Leningrad is not simply a story of war, it is a story of humanity under pressure so great it nearly cracked the very foundations of society. In remembering Leningrad, we do not merely honor the dead or celebrate survival, we confront the capacity of human systems to inflict and endure the unimaginable. The siege demands not just admiration or mourning, but reflection. On the price of political ideology, on the fragility of cities in wartime, and on the profound question of what it means to survive when survival itself becomes the only act of resistance left.